Well, honoring the fact of being on time, we will start with this session entitled Society and Environmental Policies, which is part of the second day of this International Conference on Geography and the Environment 2013. The topic on hand is a very highly interesting topic, and it has to do with the way in which public policies have a linkage with society, which is a very important aspect. Of course, we have listened to brilliant speakers, and we have seen the amazing use of tools. And I'm sure that the environment and geography aspects do not end there. It also has to do with policies. And since policy, one of the classic German writers is the queen of the arts, because it's the most complicated, most complex thing in human nature, because it has to do with agreements and achieving consensus, in placing wills, hearts behind a purpose and an objective, and it's surely one of the most complicated things which we have to solve when it comes to the environment. The environment, as we all know, is one of the great paradigms of this century, and I would say in ethical and philosophical terms is a powerful paradigm, but in stakeholders' terms, in that term of gaining those wills, the hearts, and to really land down the policies, it's still weak. We have listened to those arguments in several sessions. We are lacking data. Sometimes we have too many laws, but we don't have enough applications, follow-up, control of different things, generation of indicators, measurements. And when we talk about the environment, we talk about a great cross-sectionality in many ways, which has to do with a higher difficulty for this subject. So I'm honored in presenting and receiving two great speakers. I really think they're great because they are two very important people when it comes to public policies in Mexico regarding the environment. So I am honored to introduce, at my right, at your left, the chemical industrial engineer Alfonso Flores Ramírez. He is the general director for the impact and environmental risk of the Semarnat, which is the Ministry of the Environment and Natural Resources. So, for those of you who are the foreigners, it's the Ministry of State that is oriented towards the environment and natural resources. Alfonso Flores Ramírez is, like I said, the chemical engineer from the Technical Institute of Celaya. He has a master's in chemical engineering, with specialized in the minimization of dangerous or hazardous resources from the Technological Institute of Higher Studies of Monterrey. And he has been working for over 20 years in environmental management and also management of hazardous materials, and also the development and implementation of prevention programs for pollution and minimization of residues in different industrial sectors. He has undertaken several positions in public administration at a federal level, and he's also participating in the Federal Electricity Commission as an environmental supervisor. Also here with us, we have biologist Alfredo Arellano Guillermo, who is a biologist who studied at the National University of Mexico and from the environmental programs led from the Colegio de Mexico. He has undertaken several research programs on the monarch butterfly. He has also coordinated research alongside a civil association called Asociación Civil Monarca. He has been the head of the department of the Yucatan Protected Areas, director of the Biosphere Reserve of Siancan. And in the federal government, he has been regional director of National Protected Areas of Yucatan and the Mexican Caribbean for the National Commission of Natural Protected Areas. In this institution, he is currently holding the position of General Director of Regional Operations. So I think we have a really high-level panel, and I'm sure we will take advantage of this, and we will be familiarized with the public policies from two different standpoints and aspects of the environment in Mexico. The mechanics, I will explain it quickly. Each speaker will have 20 minutes for their presentations. At the end, maybe to adjust the agenda, we will have maybe 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A session. And if possible, we will try to wrap up with some considerations regarding agreements, collaboration conventions, something regarding really landing the ideas spoken on the panel. So I would like to thank you for your participation, and now I will give the floor to Alfonso Flores. Welcome. Well, good afternoon. First of all, receive a greeting from the Secretary Juan José Guerrabut and also the Vice Minister Rafael Paquiano. It's a joy for me to be here in this international conference of geography and the environment, which are two aspects that are very interlinked in public policies. The presentation I'm going to give starts from the general and it goes to more particular subjects, so we can talk about, especially people who come from other countries, so we can see where the environmental policies of Mexico are, what are the main objectives of the Mexican policies, and which will be declared in the sectorial program of natural resources, which will be published shortly, and which are the priorities of the ministry when it comes to the environment. I hope this doesn't imply that I run out of time. Okay, there we go. Like I said, I'm going to start from the general topics to the more particular topics, like I said, especially for the people who come from other countries in this international conference. Well, the public policy when it comes to the environment is immersed within the National Development Plan, which is the instrument that rules the public policies in our country, and in which throughout this 2013-2018 administration has 5 main pillars or axes work. The first one is to achieve peace in Mexico. The second one is to achieve a Mexico which is inclusive. The third one is to achieve a Mexico with high quality education. And the fourth one is where we have the environmental sector, which is to achieve a prosperous Mexico, but respecting and looking after the environment. And the fifth axis is to reposition Mexico at a global level, especially in the international participation with global responsibility. Okay, now within this National Development Plan, we have two main objectives. One has to do with a strategy and the implementation of a comprehensive development policy that supports sustainability and mainly with the participation of the society. And here we have basically three priority actions, which I think the most important one is to update and align the environmental laws. As the moderator accurately said, I think we have too many laws in some regards, and someone started saying that from 2003, we started really dismembering the law for the care of the environment when we had general laws. And then we just have some titles because the only one that is not enforced, that is still in discussion in the Senate, is the law for the quality of the air. And now we have another law that just came in force on July 7th. And another one of the very important activities is to propel the comprehensive planning of the territory, and this has to do with the panel going on next door, because we need to take the territorial planning and the ecological planning of the territory have to be together. They cannot be opposites, and one saying one thing and the other one saying the opposite thing. They have to go hand to hand, and they have to be comprehensive. And something very important now is to achieve a national policy when it comes to seas and coastlines that allows us to take advantage of the resources, and especially that it diminishes the risk of vulnerabilities given based on the climatic change. I'm not going to go too much in depth, but I think Mexico is one of the examples of the countries that can be more vulnerable before the climate change. You know what happened 2 weeks ago. And the main pillar is the national strategy for the climatic change. This national strategy within the National Development Plan is involved in two main actions. One that has to do with accelerating our promotion and economical development in low carbon, which has to do with all the productive sectors, both the primary, secondary, and tertiary, develop themselves sustainably without the carbon and lowering their emissions. And on the other hand, also achieving the fact that the regions are established based on the sustainability and vulnerability criteria, so that with these instruments we can avoid the settlement of populations or ecosystems in vulnerable areas in order to protect them from negative situations. Now, within the ministry, like I said, we will have this new program that will be coming out soon. We have 6 lines of actions. The first one has to do with promoting and facilitating the sustainable and sustained growth with the participation of the society, and that is low in the carbon emissions, and also to reestablish the comprehensive management of the water basins. The third one is to recover and to restore the natural wealth or the biodiversity of our country. And the fourth one has to do with achieve a comprehensive management of residues and wastes, and not just having a final disposition, correct one in one place, but to get public policies that aid in the separation, recycling, and the final disposal of these wastes. And finally, to achieve a participation from the international community, which is more efficient, especially when it comes to climate change, because as we have seen, what Mexico can contribute, or all the countries of the Americas, will really be very important in order to try to solve this problem we have of the climate change. However, it is necessary to make countries aware, countries such as India, China, or even the US, that they have to support this. Otherwise, the contribution of Mexico and the other Latin American countries is minimal compared to the contribution of China, India, and the US. Within the National Strategy for Climate Change, the principles of these strategy is sustainability on ecosystems and natural resources, prevention on damages on the environment and preservation of the ecosystems, comprehensiveness and cross-sectionality of the coordination and cooperation, and finally, the environmental responsibility. So what can I do from the moment we are saving energy in, let's say, when we're at home, when you just turn off a light, you are saving some energy, because every time you leave a light on in your house, there's a risk to, let's say, the state of Tabasco, because they get floods very often. And within this strategic line, which is to achieve sustainably green growth, what we look for is to achieve green markets, which is something that in Europe is a reality, and we are working on that. And these are those investments that are sustainable and that have low carbon emissions. In our country, just like information, 7% of the GDP comes from environmental deterioration, and from this we can say that 914 billion have to do with the degradation of natural resources, and the other contribution has to do with atmospheric pollution problems, which is poor air quality. So with these numbers, with these figures, we get 7% of the GDP which is being affected. The priority of the ministry will be to diminish the greenhouse effect gases up to 30% by 2020 and by 50% in 2050, compared with the baseline, which was taken in the year 2000, when the first communications were developed regarding climatic change in our country. And on the other hand, we tried to promote the conversion, the energy conversion, and to look for other options that are not as harmful for the environment, such as the non-usage of fossil fuels, and to use more gas, natural gas. Because as you can see here in the chart, the economic growth of Mexico is linked to its emissions. We can see how the GDP, which is in the upper part of the chart, and the environmental area of the chart have the same trend. And in the lower side, we can see how that growth is diminishing, and also the cover of natural resources that has to do with the loss of forests, rainforests, or timber. Within this promotion, to achieve this energetic change, we need to be clear on the two main problems. The first one is the energy production, and energy production is in the creation of electricity, the generation of electricity, because as you can see in the chart on the left, some of it comes from fossil, thermoelectric, carboelectric, and so on. And on the other hand, in the consumption, the area that affects the most with the emissions is the transportation in its different stages. So it's very important to reach this conversion of the non-usage of fossil fuels towards natural gas or other alternative sources of energy that are renewable. Now, where is this immersed? Well, first and foremost, I think it's in the juridical safety and certainty, which is what all states must provide to their citizens, and in this case, towards the economic development activities. And this is based on a legal framework. And obviously, the first floor is to achieve the safety through the compliance of the regulation and normativity. This is not a workshop for environmental regulations, but you can see here some of the laws that have to do with the environment. So I think we have to analyze and to re-engineer the way we need to do this so that these mechanisms are more efficient and effective. But this is the first floor of what all investments have to do to prove they comply with a regulation at a national level. Now, within the Vice Ministry of Management and more focused on our topic, which is the way in which the geographic systems and the different public policies can have an impact on the improvement of the environment and the conservation of natural resources. I'm going to present 4 strategies which we're working with. One is a system that's already operational, which you can have access to it, which is the Geographic Information System known as CIGMA, the ProAire, the programs for the quality of the air, and all the activities we're programming with the strategic environmental assessment, which is where we will leap forward to try to assess programs and plans in a comprehensive way and in a way that is more functional than other than just project by project. One example is the National Program for Port Infrastructure, the National Program for Electric Infrastructure, to have a greater certainty and not just to be assessing things in an isolated fashion. And finally, it has to do with the digital government strategy, and the President will talk about it in a few days to work on it. In the case of CIGMA, just as a background, I'll tell you that from 2003 to 2012, the ministry has worked to have a tool that gathers all the information from the geographical layers to assess the environmental impact. And up until 2011, 2012, we have a system, and in 2012 we have a public version, which you can have access from our webpage. So what is this Geographic Information System? This system is a support tool which can give us a first picture on the location of a project, given that with technological advances, with the development of layers of information that are relevant environmentally, and especially with the institutional participation of the ministry with the INEGI and other institutions, we have the main information layers with which we can see the incidence of a project in sensitive areas. I'm not going to talk about that because Alfredo will talk about that when it comes to the national protected areas, but we can see the distance from a natural protected area, a distance from a mangrove community if it's immersed within a priority hydrologic area or a priority terrestrial area, or if it's within a regional area that is restrictive or prohibitive. So this way we get a first picture with which we can see the first filter of feasibility for a project, which is its linkage with juridical instruments or with sensitive ecosystems. So mainly, like I was saying, we have the different layers that has to do with natural areas, mangroves, water basins, forest mass, and regional, ecological, and urban development plans that are in this format, because unfortunately I think this is something that's pending as a country, that these urban development plans have to go to an geographic information system, because some of them were published by local entities and they did it with traditional methods, like to delimit, like some other methods. So we don't really have a spatial certainty of where things are. Now, within this digital strategy of the government, what we look to do is to have electronic processes or steps, and Semarnat was one of the pilot areas that was selected by this office, so that the steps or the paperwork for this will be systemized so that we can do it electronically in the near future, and we don't have to do it to just review it on paper, and that way we don't really have a certainty of the information. Whereas if it's in a format of electronic step, we will have more certainty that the information that will be emptied will be true, and that is one of the problems we have with the Profepa at the time of verifying the information from these things. Now, when it comes to ProAire, since it's one of the main goals, we need to achieve that the main atmospheric basins of the country have a program for the management of the quality of the air. Now, the first ProAire that is per basin is the metropolitan area of the Valley of Mexico, and the one that was presented in February, that is the air quality program of the Bajío Basin, that has the municipalities of Salamanca, Irapuato, and Celaya. So we need to achieve 57 administration and air quality programs. And like I said, to achieve this, we need to go towards the strategic evaluation, environmental evaluation, in order to have a better decision-making progress on the pertinence of the programs and national plans, especially with infrastructure, roadways, oil, and so on. Okay. With this, we have all the tools, we have all the strategies, and of course this goes hand to hand with an active citizen participation in order to achieve these objectives. And as we all know, I think it is necessary for the contribution of each and one of us in order to achieve these goals and to be able to transform Mexico, which is the most clear and precise statement that the President of Mexico mentioned from his first day. I'm open for any questions or comments or even claims when the panel is over. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now we will listen to our next speaker, Alfredo Arellano.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. Luis Fede McDonald sends his regards from he's from National Protected Areas, and my presentation is focused on looking at the complexity of the natural protected areas from environmental governance point of view. Nowadays, our coverage is 176 natural protected areas in Mexico. And that means 9% of the surface and 1.7% of patrimonial sea, with a total of 25 million hectares, which have territorial management. In addition, we work in over 10 million hectares, which we have considered priority regions for conservation and Ramsar sites, which comes from a series of international agreements focused on preserving certain sites that have a relative importance. We also have from the private initiative sector, we have 326 areas which are voluntarily destined to conservation, distributed in 18 states of the countries, which represent 370,000 hectares. In addition, it is worth mentioning that in the last 10 years, in this graph, we can look at the increase of natural protected areas in the country, which take us to the current coverage we have nowadays throughout the country. We are covering areas from the largest peak in the country, which is the Pico of Orizaba, up to seas with depths of 2,500 meters and in the Pacific. And this takes us to trying to protect representative ecosystems for the country, and that will allow us to maintain the biological diversity and the ecosystem functioning of our resources, our natural resources. Protected areas and public goods or assets. Why do we protect areas? Why do we make decrees to protect them? It is important to mention that protected areas are ruled by public interest. And if we look at it from a traditional economy point of view, what Alfonso mentioned, with the GNP, ecologic GNP. However, the loss that we are having annually because of environmental degradation, this factor isn't integrated to traditional economy, which attributes less importance to this degradation. This degradation happens annually, but if it's not taken into account to the traditional economy, it will keep on being considered as something far away from national economy. From the conservation via public interest, private interest is now taken into account, but now we have owners and we have private property that is being affected from an economic standpoint. However, the benefit can be seen in the long term. The natural protected areas represent the best preserved areas for the capital from Mexico, and this generates a strategic flow of goods and services, environmental goods and services. And as I mentioned before, because of the property structure, it flows as positive externality, and this affects its conservation and preserving. We have protected areas because of natural capital, because of the possibility to use natural resources in the long term, and because they are areas of opportunity for education, scientific research, and to implement innovative practices for the handling of natural resources. These are some of the benefits, but this list can be larger. During the history of natural protected areas in Mexico that go from the end of the 800s to nowadays, those who are expropriatory from the territory or those who are regulatory and the utilization of natural resources. The first one hasn't been used since the 80s. And this happened after the copying of models from the United States and Europe, where the government was the owner of the land. But our distribution of land is different. There are many failed expropriation indemnizations, and we are behind with unpaid expropriation from the decrease in the 30s when Lázaro Cárdenas was the president of the country, and many parks were taken into this decrease, and their environmental function has been lost over time. But we still have some, we're still behind some indemnizations. At the end of the 80s, the models have changed, and things have been driven towards regulatory use of land. That is, the property is maintained. This model has allowed us to point out that this instrument, that natural protected areas, may be a model of governance, of territorial governance, territory governance. From the administration standpoint, there is management, and the instrument has been more popular. We have 100 applications for new natural protected areas that don't necessarily meet the criterion to be of interest to the Federation, because the instrument can be abused, and it can be used to resolve conflicts. To establish a decrease in this property, we will look at a couple of examples ahead, and we will go into detail in here. This governance model has allowed and is still allowing to define attributions and competencies between the organisms in the government that hadn't been previously defined. Who is responsible for defining the use of land in this territory? And as I mentioned before, it becomes a tool to solve conflicts. I don't intend for you to read this, but this is a view of the difficulty that the main agencies cause in here, because we have very small attributions on licenses, concessions, and the application of development programs in a certain territory. So we try to push and to coordinate and to make a comprehensive attempt for this territory. I'm just listing a series of permissions, of authorizations needed for the change of use of land from several areas of our own ministry, like SAGARPA, SST, CEDESOL, which are the ministries that have attributions over the use of resources. So the difficulty is the policies, because if we are proposing a field and a forest, one ministry comes to another and to incentivize the agriculture, and they don't allow us to manage the territory. I'm going to list a couple of examples of conditions that are happening, recent conditions that are focused in this complexity that I was talking about. First of all, the National Park of Tulum in the coast of Quintana Roo. This was, the decree happened in 1981. It was an expropriatory decree where the state government supported the decree. And years later, with the change of administration, new property titles were given or granted, which implied a legal complication. I won't talk much about the background. I could talk for hours about this. When they start looking, when the lawyers start looking at this project, there's a lot of legal implications here, but I won't talk about that. In 2004, in the Solidaridad municipal began the management in order to modify the urban development plan for the Tulum population center. This included the national park. In this plan, the intention was to increase the surface of the population center to include the national park as a part of it, and it assigned development policies, urban development policies, for the coast of the park. And after many negotiations and telling them, no, you cannot do this, these are federation faculties, because according to the Constitution, it was the local legislation who had to place the ruling, but there was an agreement for the urban development plan with the condition that this could be reverted by the federation. And in 2008, the government states the PDU and states that until a federal judge doesn't say the opposite, the decree is existent, expropriations exist, and the assigned density of the construction within the PDU will be 0. However, it is established that if federal justice supports the proprietary, then the territory will have construction densities. This was the political standpoint for this urban development plan. This is a panoramic view of the National Park of Tulum. There was another small problem here. If there are topographers here, they will know that measurement instruments in the 80s or 70s were quite precarious. They were not precise, and what was intended was to, if you look at the red polygon, once this is mapped, that the topographic analytical description is mapped for the decree, part of the park fell to the sea. So the state talked about this too, that the park wasn't well located, that there were inconsistencies in their jurisdiction. But in the complete file of the park creation, it was established that it was 100% on ground. So this allowed the court that reviewed the case to place the polygon on Earth again. And the last one was the yellow polygon. The federal government established a ruling in 2008, a controversy, in 2008. And they declared the inclusion of National Park Tulum as unconstitutional. What were the key bullet points in this ruling? For a unanimous 11 votes, the court declared the agreement invalid. For the National Park Tulum and the archaeological monument zone Tulum Tanca, with 9 votes in favor corresponding to the federation, determining how it will coordinate with the local government. Somebody asked me one time, is it worth investing so much time? It was from 2004 until 2011 that we were in a continuous struggle, political, media, court, to solve this. And I said, yes, it is worth it because of one simple reason, because this isn't happening. This is generating jurisprudence, and who should be the one to attribute the use of land to protected areas? This will solve cases in all the country, not just Tulum, because this duality has always existed. Who has the necessary attributes to determine the use of land within natural protected areas? Other interesting issues in the ruling is that the plan was unconstitutional because the local government used faculties about the urbanization of the land, which is an area subject to a special protection, and it is corresponded exclusively to the federation. And the park doesn't have an urbanistic intention, so those criterion cannot be assigned to it. And it was necessary that the court judge, as it was a federal property, we tended to think that we were allowed to do this because it was a federal territory. But in this last conclusion, it says that in this trial, the Federation was right, but in private property, the Federation still has the faculties to determine the use of land in national parks and the rest of natural protected areas. This is a summary. The right location of the polygon was set, which is 100% on ground, the faculties for the federal government, and the validity of the expropriation decree. So many years had to happen for this to take place. Okay, I will take just half a minute for this. This is the reserve, biosphere reserve in Wirikuta in San Luis Potosí. You might have heard of this with the huicholes. This is a sacred site. And there's mining, there's concessions for mining, but no one owns the land. One's a user and one's a concessionaire. And there's farmers there, and the interests go all over the place. We think that if this is set as a federal protected area, that can happen. I'm going to leave it here, but thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much. We open up a microphone for a few minutes. Please identify yourself and state who the question is directed to. Good afternoon. My name is Julián Domínguez Reyes. What can be done to eliminate social injustice or inequity if you cut off the but if people mangrove, what happens if trash goes to the mangrove? What can be done to eliminate social injustice? I think the question goes beyond the presentation, and this is a true conflict in our country. Environmental justice, sadly, it can sometimes be applied where it is defended. I mean, we have placed claims on people with low economic resources, and judges might set them free because of their social economic condition. We have presented claims for people with higher economic resources who defend themselves through lawyers, and they sometimes win, they sometimes lose. But they are sometimes focused on fees and compensations. In very few cases, we have jail sentences. There is a group of Menonitas who have been in jail for a couple of months because of deforestation without any authorization in Quintana Roo. Peninsula de Yucatan in Quintana Roo, where they, without authorization, they invaded. They took down 300 hectares for agriculture without having the adequate documents, and this implied jail procedures are delicate. They're complex. The Mexican legal system, I am not a specialist, but this is a very complex subject, and it requires a lot of improvements, especially regarding the environment. The process of making up a file, which can be determining to setting someone free, or the defense itself. In the back first, please. Please go ahead. Good morning. My name is Tony Aguilara. I come from Colombia, the University of Córdoba. And my question, I think any of the two speakers can answer it. In Colombia, after the Earth Summit in the 90s, environmental legislation was created, and it was very good. And the national system, the environment national system was created as well. However, the results of these laws and these rulings haven't been very good. There are many issues still. So I would like to know how efficient have the environmental policies have been for Mexico. Because I see that there's also a certain amount of laws that have been created for the protection of the environment. Have the results been the same? Or have you actually had any progress in Mexico? To try to answer your question, I think that, as mentioned in my presentation, the first floor is legislation and regulation to try to organize projects and investments that want to be made in a country and that is part of the public politics. The case you were talking about is very interesting because in February it will be 25 years since it came into effect. And as I mentioned, unfortunately, from the legislative standpoint, there's other laws that started coming out, special and general. And I will have 5 examples. In 2004, sustainable forest, which involved a federal fund in forestry matters. If it has had certain benefits, it has also had a certain amount of injustice, because the supports for this compensation are not yet as efficient. So that the first user for the environment will be the one benefited. And in 2003, there's the law for the residues, which tried to regulate the residues, urban and dangerous. And unfortunately, because of the Constitution, which attributes the local governments to collect and dispose the residues, the 2,500 local governments have a final place to deposit these residues. And then the wildlife law in 2007, known as the mangrove law, where it is prohibited to extract or to fill out or to burn anything that will affect the mangrove. And this is a very complex situation because in order to demonstrate this, a large investment needs to be performed. Studies are very costly in order to prove that they haven't been affected. And during the last year, with the importance that the climate change is taking, the new law for general law on climate change comes into effect. So what is being said now is if we don't solve the climate change issue from the standpoint of adaptation, mitigation, and resilience of the ecosystems and these effects, I don't think any of the public policies will benefit us. The national priority, is focused in tending to climate change. If we tend to it, we can solve some of the specific matters environmental matters. That's what I can tell you from the Mexican experience. My name is Hortensia Medina from the INEGI. What is the concrete strategy for the gases and the effect they have on climate change in order to achieve economic growth? How do we diminish the emissions of the transport? The data was 67%, and it has just reduced 3 percentage points. What are the urban concrete policies on the reduction of transport with a fossil gas? And here we have the Metrobus, but in other entities we don't have any of that. How can we achieve that with that very important policy on climate change? In this sense, I believe that it is very important. I mentioned it, and that we need to transform and go from an economy that uses other energies, eolic, hydro energy, or in the north, solar energy, in order to start reducing fossil energy. One of the main pillars is to achieve certain percentages in alternative fuels. It's not just promoting this, but reaching certain percentages of the different type of energy or fuels. As you mentioned it, the Metrobus case has represented a very important reduction in the transport emissions. And we have tried to do this in the other states. There are certain projects for the state of Jalisco where there's transport dedicated to passengers, ADO, both in Guadalajara and Veracruz, to try to do these projects through collective systems that will drive the use of this type of transportation and will diminish the use of cars. We can go into the debate with the program of vehicular verification, which are always controversial because we think they are not giving anything, because we need to go and verify our vehicle every 6 months. And those are the perverse incentives that the automotive industry is trying to look forward to, so that everyone can have one vehicle. The citizens now have 3 cars per person. There are programs where people cannot take their vehicles out in the city, but I think that the strategy is most important here. And the program from the ministry is clean transportation, which will be taken not only to federal and big enterprises that use transportation, but we want to use a specific strategy for urban use and clean transportation, but we need to achieve a transition and drive the use of alternative fuels like natural gas. The proposal for the reform is there for the green tax in order to authorize fossil fuels. I will force you not to use it and to use alternative fuels.
¿Alguna pregunta más? ¿Una más? No tantas porque no vamos a comer. Yo creo que si somos concretos al preguntar y responder, sí alcanzamos.
I think if we are concrete when we ask and when we answer, we can achieve all the questions. The temporality of the resolutions, which is the one that you handle? Because we have seen that there are primary vegetations the mangroves situation, and when one is on the field, it is completely affected. So, to make a manifest for environmental impact is hard. I think there will be a more efficient process now, but what are you doing to use the satellite images and ortho pictures and field visits? Because in many places, this is out of context. Citing my teammate from Veracruz, in the Alvarado Laguna, there are mangroves, and people make a living out of there. You cannot go in there because it is restricted. So what is done with the documents in these certain places? What is important, I will answer fast so that someone else can ask a question, is using IT. Our geographic IT, we had a session with corporate Pemex and the 4 subsidiaries, amongst others. And the second has to do with the updating of the instruments of the classification of territory. Many are based on spatial scales that don't reach final resolution. And we have the case in the southeast where we are confusing certain lands because of the promotion practices. They get transformed into grassland or agriculture. And that is why the government instruments are very important, and the utilization of information technologies. Good afternoon, Ricardo from Itesa. My question is very concrete. Are there any public policies in biological corridors? We have seen how natural protected areas are islands that have a biological cycle in a more regional. So the connectivity of natural areas is implied there. Of course, the biological corridors is a subject that we are very interested in this sector, in Semarnat, particularly the Conavio, and we are working on it. There are projects that have been in place for several years. The Mesoamerican corridor, which is working on the Yucatan Peninsula in Chiapas and in Oaxaca. It's been in place for over 10 years in order to integrate policies so that they coordinate areas of biological importance. We also have the support of the German agency for the corridor of the Sierra Madre Oriental, which goes through the states of Hidalgo, Veracruz, Puebla, San Luis, and Querétaro. We are in the planning phase of this project, and the idea is to search for investments to work in the Sierra Madre. And the third one, which is in the planning stage as well, which is in the Jalisco and Nayarit zone. I missed the name. What's the name of the project? I can't remember it, but its intention is to work in these areas where we don't have natural protected areas, but this instrument, the vision of this instrument will allow us to apply policies, sustainable policies, in order to preserve the natural resources. One more over here, please. Last one. Miguel Zúñiga from Pemex. Natural protected areas are information that many government areas need or use. What are the possibilities that they can be used by web services? Because every year they have to be updated, and many institutions do this. We have customers such as the people from exploration and refining that use this information, and we need to update it. I think it would be very efficient if we it could be done via web services, not to update it. When you update this, you say that there are 100 applications. Maybe the updating isn't so dynamic, but there is movement from one year to another, which is why I am requesting if this could be distributed via web. We take your request. We have a geographic IT website where you can go into the maps of the protected areas, which is open to everyone. Of course, we need to update the cartography. But the regulations that are established for the programs are online for those that have been decreed. For the proposals, we cannot upload them until we have the definite decree, but the documentation for the previous studies, we do have it for the cases where the proposals are more advanced, but they are available as information, as public information. Thank you very much. We are closing up with this. In 1990, when Octavio Paz received the Nobel Prize, he talked about the relationship made in nature, and he had a phrase where it says, defending nature today is defending humanity. There's a lot to do still. 15 years ago, Octavio Paz passed away, and the environmental agenda still has many issues to go through, many agreements, many work between institutions, more participation from the citizens, more regulations in some matters, less regulation in others, etc. I want to thank the speakers that visited us today, and I would like to thank them with an applause while we grant them some gifts.